They say you should love thy neighbor, but they never tell you what to do when your neighbor is a thief protected by the HOA. For months, she treated my solar grid like her personal gas station, her brand new Tesla sipping the power my family depended on. She just smiled that smug smile, knowing her position on the board gave her a free pass. I filed complaints. I sent evidence. They called me petty and delusional. So, I was left with only one option. She never stopped to consider that the very system she exploited could be controlled, or what would happen if someone pushed the voltage to its absolute, unforgiving maximum. And she was about to find out. Before my life became a quiet war waged over watts and volts, it was peaceful. My wife, Sarah, and I had poured everything into our home in the pristine, oak-lined community of Maple Creek. It was the kind of place you see in commercials, perfectly manicured lawns, kids riding bikes in the fading afternoon light, and a comforting sense of order. We'd wanted a safe, predictable life for our daughter, Lily, and for a while, we had it. My contribution to that dream, my personal obsession, was a gleaming array of solar panels covering our roof. I'm an engineer, and to me, self-sufficiency is the ultimate form of security. The solar project was my masterpiece. I spent nearly a year researching, getting permits, and overseeing the installation. The HOA, run by a stern but seemingly fair man named Mr. Henderson, had been surprisingly cooperative, swayed by the Green Initiative angle. The day I first flipped the switch and saw our meter spin backward, I felt a profound sense of pride. Our house was breathing, generating its own power. It was a fortress of sustainability, a testament to careful planning and hard work. The system included a large battery backup in the garage, ensuring that even during a blackout, Lily's nightlight would stay on and our food would stay cold. It was our independence, humming quietly from the heart of our home. Life next to Carol Henderson was, at first, unremarkable. She was the HOA president's wife, a woman who seemed to glide through the neighborhood with an air of untouchable authority. Her greetings were always a little too sweet, her compliments on our garden always felt like inspections. When her husband bought her a top-of-the-line Tesla, it became the centerpiece of their driveway, a silent, gleaming monument to their status. She would polish it daily, her movements slow and proprietary, as if daring the world to challenge its perfection. We exchanged pleasantries, offered waves across the lawn, and maintained the carefully constructed illusion of suburban harmony. There was no reason to suspect the storm that was brewing behind her perfectly composed smile. The first hint of trouble was subtle, almost unnoticeable. An anomaly in my power grid's monitoring software. Every night, around 2 a.m., I'd see a small but consistent drain on our battery system, a drain that had no logical source within our home. I initially chalked it up to a software bug or a calibration error. I spent hours running diagnostics, checking connections, and trying to isolate the ghost in my machine. As an engineer, I believed every problem had a logical solution, and I was determined to find it. The thought that the problem might not be inside my house hadn't yet crossed my mind. The sanctity of our property, of our quiet little world, was still an assumption I took for granted. That assumption was shattered one Tuesday morning before sunrise. I had woken up early to troubleshoot the system again, my frustration mounting. Stepping outside with a flashlight into the damp, pre-dawn air, I traced the conduit from the battery unit along the side of the house. That's when I saw it. A thin, black cable, almost invisible against the dark mulch of the flower bed, snaking its way from the side of Carol's garage. It crossed the invisible property line, a silent trespasser, and was plugged directly into the weatherproof external outlet I had installed for my power tools. The outlet was tied directly to my solar grid. I just stood there for a full minute, flashlight beam fixed on the connection, my mind struggling to process the audacity. My fortress had been breached. This wasn't a glitch, it was theft. It was a conscious, deliberate act. She was plugging her six-figure electric car into my family's power source while we slept. The quiet hum of my system no longer sounded like independence, it sounded like a silent scream. I calmly walked over, unplugged the cord, and coiled it neatly on her doorstep. I didn't leave a note. I thought the message was clear enough. It was a mistake, I told myself. A one-time, inexplicable lapse in judgment. But when I woke up the next morning and saw the cable plugged in again, I knew this was no mistake. It was a declaration of war. The morning after my second discovery, I decided to handle things face to face. The polite, neighborly approach. I walked over as Carol was getting out of her Tesla, the charging cable still lying like a dead serpent on her driveway. I kept my voice calm and even, explaining that she must have mistakenly been using my private outlet, which was connected to my solar system. I told her it was causing a significant drain and asked her to please stop. Her reaction was a masterclass in psychological warfare. First came the wide-eyed, innocent denial. She had no idea what I was talking about. Her charger had a long cord, maybe the wind blew it over. It was an absurd explanation, a blatant lie delivered with the unflinching confidence of someone who had never been held accountable for anything. When I gently pushed back, stating that I had seen the cord plugged in 2 mornings in a row, her demeanor shifted. The faux sweetness curdled into a cold, condescending glare. She accused me of being aggressive, of harassing her. She reminded me, in a voice dripping with venomous sugar, that her husband was the HOA president and that they took neighborhood disputes, especially baseless accusations, very seriously. The threat was clear, wrapped in a veneer of civility. I walked back to my house, the conversation replaying in my mind. The casual way she lied, the immediate pivot to victimhood, the veiled threat. This wasn't just about a free charge for her car anymore. This was about power. She was showing me that she could take whatever she wanted, and I was helpless to stop her. In that moment, I knew the neighborly approach was dead on arrival. The engineer in me decided it was time for a new strategy, irrefutable data. If she wanted to play games, I would respond with facts. That afternoon, I purchased a high-resolution wildlife camera, small enough to be concealed perfectly within the dense foliage of a rose bush that had a clear, direct view of the outlet. It was motion-activated and had night vision. Then, I spent the evening on my computer, setting up a specific monitoring protocol in my solar grid software. I created an alert that would log the exact time a new, significant power draw was initiated from the external outlet, how many kilowatts were being pulled, and for how long. I was building a case, piece by meticulous piece. I felt a surge of cold determination. She could lie to my face, but she couldn't lie to a time-stamped video file and a detailed energy log. The trap was set. It didn't take long. Just before 2:30 a.m., my phone buzzed with the alert I'd configured. The system was registering a consistent 7.2 kilowatt draw. I pulled up the live feed from the camera on my laptop. The grainy, monochrome image showed Carol, wrapped in a silk robe, moving with a practiced stealth. She looked left, then right, before stooping down to plug the cable into my outlet. The camera even caught the faint, smug upturn of her lips as she walked back to her garage. I watched for a few minutes, my blood boiling as I saw the battery percentage on my system monitor tick downward. I recorded everything. For the next 3 nights, the scene repeated itself like a ritual. And every night, I saved the footage. I now had 4 separate video files, each one a nail for her coffin. I compiled everything into a formal complaint to the HOA, the videos, the energy logs, a timeline of events, and a polite but firm request for intervention. I sent the email to the entire board, including her husband. I had her. The evidence was absolute. This had to be the end of it. The response I received a week later was not what I expected. It was a formal letter, printed on the HOA's official letterhead. It stated that the board had reviewed my complaint and found it to be without merit. They claimed the video footage was taken from an ambiguous angle and could not definitively prove a violation. They suggested the power logs could be the result of a system malfunction. But they didn't stop there. The second half of the letter was a counter-accusation. I was being formally reprimanded for the installation of an unapproved surveillance device on my property. They cited a vague bylaw about alterations affecting neighborhood aesthetics and privacy. They were fining me $500. I read the letter 3 times, the words blurring together in a haze of disbelief and fury. They had taken my mountain of evidence, dismissed it with a wave of the hand, and then weaponized their rulebook to punish me for trying to expose the truth. They weren't just protecting her, they were actively joining her in the attack. That fine was the first shot in a campaign of relentless harassment. Suddenly, I was a target. I received a notice that my lawn was 1/4 of an inch too high. A week later, another fine because my daughter's tricycle had been left on the porch for a few hours. They sent a violation letter claiming the paint on my mailbox was an unapproved shade of black, even though it was the same one we'd had for 5 years. It was a death by 1,000 cuts, a suffocating barrage of petty infractions designed to bury me in fines and paperwork. Carol, meanwhile, had become even more brazen. She no longer bothered to hide. She would plug her car in during the late afternoon, sometimes giving me a little wave from her window if she saw me watching. She was untouchable, and she knew it. The very system that was supposed to maintain order was being used as a weapon of personal vengeance. My sense of peace was gone, replaced by a constant, gnawing anxiety. I felt like a prisoner in my own home. My wife urged me to just let it go, to pay the fines and maybe even install a lock on the outlet. But it was too late for that. It was the principle of the thing. This was my home, my power, and I refused to be bullied into submission. My final conventional option was to seek legal counsel. I found a lawyer who specialized in HOA disputes. He listened patiently to my story, reviewed my evidence, and then gave me the soul-crushing reality. He said I had a clear case, but fighting an HOA is a war of attrition. They would use our own HOA dues to fund their legal defense, drowning me in motions and delays. He estimated the legal fees could easily climb into the tens of thousands of dollars, with no guarantee of a win. They can afford to bleed you dry, he said, his voice full of tired sympathy. I left his office feeling utterly defeated. The system was rigged. The rules were a weapon. The law was a luxury I couldn't afford. Carol had one. That night, I sat in my garage, staring at the glowing green lights of my solar system's control panel. The numbers taunted me, the battery level, the current output, the cumulative power generated. All my hard work, my investment, being siphoned away by a woman who represented everything I despised: arrogance, entitlement, and the abuse of power. I had tried to be civil. I had tried to be logical. I had tried to follow the rules. Every path was a dead end. As I stared at the main inverter, my eyes fell on the technician's interface panel, a section I rarely ever touched. It was for diagnostics, for stress testing the system. And on it, I saw a setting that made my heart stop. Manual voltage output override. It was a feature designed to test the system's absolute limits, to push a controlled surge far beyond normal parameters. A cold, electric clarity washed over me. The lawyer was right, I couldn't fight them with money. The board was right, I couldn't fight them with their own rules. But in their arrogance, they had all forgotten one crucial thing. This was my grid. And I was about to set my own terms. The night I decided to fight back was unnervingly still. A heavy silence had fallen over the neighborhood, the kind that precedes a storm. My family was asleep upstairs, their steady breathing a quiet rhythm in the heart of the house, completely unaware of the verdict I was about to deliver from my garage. For hours, I sat in front of my laptop, not in anger, but in a state of cold, surgical focus. I wasn't a vigilante, I was an engineer, and this was a problem with a very specific, technical solution. I researched the charging architecture of a top-of-the-line Tesla, poring over electrical schematics and user forums where technicians discussed system tolerances. I learned that its onboard charger was a sophisticated piece of equipment, designed with multiple safeguards to protect it from common power fluctuations. But it was not, I discovered, designed to withstand a sustained, targeted, and overwhelming tidal wave of raw voltage. It was like a fortress gate built to repel a battering ram, not a tactical explosion. My goal wasn't a fire or an explosion, that was crude and dangerous. My goal was more precise, to execute a single, massive overvoltage event that would permanently disable the charging port and its connected electronics, rendering it utterly useless. A digital beheading. As midnight passed, a wave of doubt washed over me. The blinking cursor on my screen seemed to pulse in time with my own racing heart. Was this too much? I was about to willfully destroy tens of thousands of dollars of property. The legal and financial ramifications could be catastrophic if I was caught. I thought about my wife and daughter, sleeping peacefully, and the life we had built. For a moment, I almost closed the laptop. Then, I pictured Carol's smug smile. I heard the condescending tone of her husband's dismissal. I felt the sting of every baseless fine, every letter, every moment of feeling powerless in my own home. They had pushed me into this corner. They had used their power to systematically crush me. This wasn't an act of aggression. It was a calculated act of self-preservation. My resolve hardened, settling into a cold, heavy certainty in the pit of my stomach. They had left me no other way out. I opened the control interface for my solar grid. At 2:28 a.m., my phone buzzed. The familiar alert. Power draw detected, external outlet. Showtime. I pulled up the camera feed. There she was, a ghost in a silk robe, performing her nightly ritual of theft. On my system monitor, I watched the numbers settle at a steady 7.2 kilowatt draw. Her car was drinking deeply from my system. I walked over to the main control panel on the garage wall, its screen casting a pale green glow on my face. My fingers hovered over the touchscreen, then I navigated to the technician's diagnostic menu. A stark, red-lettered warning filled the screen: caution, manual override is for trained personnel only. Incorrect use can result in severe damage to the system and any connected devices. Proceed at your own risk. I pressed accept. A new screen appeared, displaying the current voltage output, a stable 240 volts. Beside it was a manual input field and a slider bar that went all the way to 1000 volts. My breath hitched. My plan was to send a short, crippling burst, a 3-second pulse of 800 volts. Long enough to fry the delicate circuitry of the charging port, but brief enough to not trip the main breakers in my house. I took one last look at the camera feed. Carol was gone, back inside her home, leaving her car tethered to mine. My hands were slick with sweat as I typed 800 into the numerical field. Another warning flashed. Voltage exceeds standard operating parameters by 333%. Confirm. I pressed confirm. The final step was to engage the override. It wasn't a switch or a button. It was a small, virtual slider on the screen labeled Initiate Pulse. I dragged it from off to on. The effect was instantaneous and deeply unsettling. The quiet hum of the inverters in my garage instantly escalated into a high-pitched, furious scream. The overhead lights in the garage flickered violently for a second, and then, from outside, I heard a sharp, percussive crack. It wasn't an explosion, but a sound like a bullwhip snapping, followed immediately by a faint, sizzling noise. On my monitor, the power draw from the outlet didn't just stop, it went haywire for a millisecond, a chaotic spike of gibberish data, and then flatlined to a perfect zero. The screaming from the inverters ceased, returning to their normal, gentle hum. The entire event had lasted maybe 3 seconds. I looked at the camera feed. A tiny wisp of acrid, blue-tinted smoke curled out from the Tesla's charging port before vanishing into the night air. The soft, pulsing green light on the charger was gone. It was dark. Dead. My heart was hammering against my ribs. I quickly navigated back through the menus, disabled the manual override, and cleared the system's short-term diagnostic logs. To any external scan, the system would now appear perfectly normal. I watched the camera feed for another 20 minutes. Nothing. The car just sat there, inert. I had done it. A wave of adrenaline and something that felt terrifyingly like triumph washed over me. I went inside, my hands shaking, and fell into a restless sleep. The next morning, the scene outside was even better than I could have imagined. A massive tow truck was parked in front of the Hendersons' house, its yellow lights flashing. Carol was on her lawn in her pajamas, her face a mask of frantic rage, gesturing wildly at her dead car. Her husband stood beside her, his arms crossed, his usual air of smug authority replaced by a deep, furrowed confusion. A small group of neighbors had gathered at a respectful distance, murmuring amongst themselves. This was my cue. I grabbed my coffee, walked out my front door, and feigned a look of neighborly concern. "Morning, Carol, Mr. Henderson," I said, my voice dripping with false sympathy. "Everything all right over here? Car trouble?" Carol's head snapped towards me, her eyes narrowing into slits of pure hatred. "You," she shrieked, pointing a trembling finger at me. "You did this. I plugged it in last night and now it's completely dead. The technician said the entire charging system is fried." She was shouting, her voice cracking, all pretense of composure gone. I took a slow sip of my coffee and widened my eyes in mock alarm. "My goodness, that's terrible," I said, letting a note of concern creep into my voice. "But what does that have to do with me?" "You sabotaged it," she screamed. "You did something to your power." I turned to the small crowd of onlookers, then back to her, and gave a slight, confused chuckle. "Carol, with all due respect, that's a very serious accusation. If my system had a power surge big enough to do that, it would have blown every circuit in my own house. My fridge would be off, my TV would be fried." I gestured back at my home. "Everything's working just fine. Are you sure it wasn't a faulty charger? I've read these electric cars can be very sensitive." Her husband put a hand on her arm, his face turning red. He knew she was sounding unhinged, making baseless accusations in front of the very people he presided over. The tow truck driver, a burly man with a clipboard, even chimed in. "Happens sometimes, ma'am. These things are like computers on wheels. One bad component and the whole system shorts out." Carol was sputtering, trapped between her certainty of my guilt and her complete inability to prove it. She had been publicly exposed, not as a powerful authority figure, but as a hysterical woman with a broken toy. As the driver hooked her silent, useless Tesla to the truck and began to winch it up, her eyes met mine. The smugness was gone, replaced by a look of pure, unadulterated loathing. She knew I had done it, and she knew she could do nothing about it. I had used my knowledge, my system, to beat her at her own game. As the tow truck pulled away, carrying the symbol of her arrogance with it, I knew I had won the battle. But as I watched the cold, calculating look in her husband's eyes, I had a feeling the war wasn't over just yet. The departure of the tow truck was not an end, but the beginning of a new, colder phase of the war. The open hostility of the morning was replaced by a suffocating, silent pressure. Carol was nowhere to be seen, but I could feel her husband's eyes on my house. Mr. Henderson was a man whose entire identity was built on control, and I had wrested that control from him in the most humiliating way possible. He couldn't prove what I had done, but his rage needed an outlet, and he still wielded the full, indiscriminate power of the HOA. 2 days later, my outlet arrived in the form of an official, registered letter. It informed me that, due to a formal complaint regarding a potential electrical hazard and uncertified system modifications, the HOA was mandating a full, third-party safety inspection of my solar installation. They had scheduled it for the following week. It was a transparently vindictive move, a desperate gambit to find a single wire out of place, a single permit I had overlooked, so they could condemn my entire system and bury me in legal fees. It was his last, best shot at destroying me. What Mr. Henderson failed to understand, however, was that he was not dealing with a hobbyist. He was challenging an engineer in his own sanctuary. For the next week, I prepared not with lawyers, but with schematics and codebooks. I went over every inch of my system, not to fix it, but to admire it. Every connection was torqued to specification, every wire was shielded and grounded beyond what the county code required. My permits were in a pristine binder, my installation plans were professionally drafted, and my system's performance logs were flawless, save for one strategically deleted diagnostic file. On the day of the inspection, two stern-faced electricians arrived, accompanied by Mr. Henderson, who stood on my driveway with his arms crossed, a grimly expectant look on his face. For 2 hours, I led them through my work. I showed them the inverters, the battery array, the rooftop connections, and the control panel. I answered every technical question with a calm, dispassionate clarity. They ran diagnostics. They tested the grounding. They checked the breakers. I watched Mr. Henderson's smug certainty slowly curdle into confused frustration as, time and time again, the electricians would look at each other, nod, and make a positive note on their checklist. Finally, they were done. The lead electrician, a man who had barely said 2 words to me, turned to Mr. Henderson and delivered the verdict. "Frankly, Mr. Henderson," he said, sounding almost impressed, "this is one of the cleanest, most professional private installations I've ever seen. It doesn't just meet code, it exceeds it in almost every category. There is absolutely no hazard here. The system is a fortress." I had to physically restrain myself from smiling as I watched the color drain from Mr. Henderson's face. He had brought his hired guns to my doorstep, and they had ended up confirming my victory. He had lost. In front of professionals, in the light of day, his baseless crusade was exposed as nothing more than a petty vendetta. He mumbled a curt thank you to the electricians and retreated back into his house without another word to me. The siege was broken. That failed inspection was the crack that shattered the Hendersons' glass house. The story of Carol's fried Tesla, followed by the HOA's failed attempt to condemn my system, became the talk of the neighborhood. The other residents, many of whom had been silently suffering under Henderson's tyrannical rule for years, saw that the emperor had no clothes. The fear he had cultivated was gone, replaced by ridicule. People who used to cross the street to avoid him now met his gaze with knowing smiles. Carol became a virtual recluse. Her social standing, built on a foundation of her husband's power, evaporated overnight. The whispers followed her whenever she left the house. Her monument, the Tesla, was gone, replaced by a modest sedan, a constant, public reminder of her downfall. The power couple of Maple Creek had become a punchline. The revolution was quiet but swift. At the next quarterly HOA meeting, a motion was raised by another board member for a vote of no confidence in Mr. Henderson's presidency, citing an abuse of power and the use of HOA funds to settle a personal score, the inspection. The motion passed with an overwhelming majority. Stripped of his title and his authority, he was just another resident, a man who had alienated everyone around him. The change in the neighborhood was palpable. The barrage of petty fines stopped. A sense of community, long suppressed by fear, began to bloom. People started talking to each other again, planning block parties, and relaxing in their own yards without fear of a violation notice. The Hendersons' reign was over, not with a bang, but with the quiet, collective sigh of a neighborhood breathing freely for the first time in years. 2 months after the vote, a "for sale" sign appeared on their perfectly manicured lawn. They couldn't stand to live in a place where they no longer held all the cards. Watching the moving truck pull away from their house, I felt a quiet, profound sense of peace. I had never wanted a war, but I had been given one, and I had finished it. My story in this neighborhood became a lesson, a reminder that power and authority are fragile things. Bullies, whether they're in a schoolyard or an HOA, operate on the assumption that you will play by a set of rules they themselves feel free to ignore. They count on your fear, your compliance, and your unwillingness to rock the boat. I had tried to play by the rules, and it had almost cost me my sanity and my savings. My victory came only when I stepped outside of their game and created my own, using the very skills and passions they had disregarded. I didn't fight them with anger or aggression, I fought them with engineering. I used the language of logic and electricity to deliver a message they couldn't ignore. In the end, the power that truly mattered wasn't the kind listed in the HOA bylaws or represented by a fancy car. It was the power I generated from the sun, the power of knowledge, and the quiet power of a person who has been pushed too far and decides, calmly and rationally, to push back. My home was a fortress once again, not just of sustainability, but of resilience. And it stands as a testament to a simple, fundamental truth: when a system is designed to be unfair, sometimes the only way to win is to cause a surge.